On behalf of the Presbyterian Church of Punxsutawney, I want to welcome you to this tribute to George West. Over this last week, I have had the honor and the privilege of getting to know George even better through the words and stories shared not only by Flo and Allie and Dave, but also through his friends here at the church. Gio, as many of you called him, was an extraordinary man. He was a best friend to all he met, a treasured grandpa who adored his 4 grandsons, Kyle, Tyler, Tristan, and Kevin, father to Allie and Dave, and most of all, beloved husband and best friend to Flo. Gio loved life, being outdoors, feeding the squirrels and birds out at Hemlock Acres, popping in to visit with his friends, spending time away at the beach looking for shark's teeth, watching the Steelers play. I love the Steelers too, so that made me feel a connection to him. And he loved his dogs, his beloved Chloe and Barnaby. They meant the world to him. I know that he was reunited with them on Sunday evening. I imagine them barking up a storm when they saw him coming. The family sent me this quote that is on a sign out at Hemlock Acres. The quote is by Kurt Vonnegut. It says, "Enjoy the little things in life, for someday you will realize they were the big things." I think this sums up the way Gio lived his life. He loved all the little things, and ultimately they ended up being the big things in his life. We will hear from some of his beloved friends and family this morning who will share their thoughts and pay tribute to this extraordinary man. We will also pay tribute to him through music, all of which we will hear this morning were some of his favorites and ones that he would have chosen himself. And when we hear them, we will feel him with us. Let us remember him in this way, living our lives in such a way that we take time to find the enjoyment in the little things and live in love and great joy. So let us now give thanks for his life and for the gift that he was and the gift that he will be to each of us.
Good morning. Guess I better take this off. What a great morning to be honoring our friend George. It's a beautiful day for a beautiful man. When Flo asked me to do this, I at first said, I don't know, Flo, I don't know if I can handle this. I've never done it before. I get nervous and I get very emotional. I hope I can control myself. But anyhow, I thought, well, I'll try it. So I went home and I started writing down things that I'd really like to say about my buddy George. And it just so happens, sorry about this, but I got about 2.5 hours worth of things I want to say. Think I'm lying? I'm in church. But what I would like you to do for George and I, we had this little thing, and we're not allowed to do it in church, or not supposed to do it in church. Greet each other with a handshake or something like that. If you would all please stand for George and I just for a second. Now I'd like you to take a look around where you're standing. You don't have to move. And look at each other and give each other a smile and a little wave. And you can be seated. You can stop anytime. The reason for that, George and I played a lot of cards together. And we had a secret code like. Women always wonder, how can they win like that all the time? Well, we smiled and winked and waved. And we got away with it up until now. We've known Wes for a good many years, probably around 15 years. We had a whole lot of fun with these people. Great people. We'd go to their house, they'd go to our house. We went to the beach with them every year. And some of the things we did down there, we just had so much fun. Hunting sharks. One thing I really enjoyed was getting up in the morning and talking to George on the front porch. He loved his coffee. So did I. So we would end up there, and then we'd either go walking with the women or else we'd go play golf or something on that line. One of my great enjoyments was George, for whatever reason, I like to think he liked Jan and I. After a while, after knowing him for a few years, George had a pit stop up at our house. He would stop there anywhere between 1 and 3 times a week. And, of course, we'd shoot the bull and everything. But anytime he stopped, I wouldn't have had to have eyesight. When that knock on the door came and I opened the door, the first thing George would say, "How are you?" That was his saying. And I'll never forget that. And then he'd walk right in and make himself at home, which is exactly what we wanted and we appreciated. Now, every time he would come, we always had a little drink. George came in the morning, coffee. George came in the afternoon, coffee. George came a little bit late in the evening, George might want something else. I have a teetotaling wife. And at my house, I get the drinks. Well, this particular day, Jan come up and she said, "George, what would you like to drink today?" A little later in the day. And he said, "I wouldn't mind a little bit of bourbon with some ice." Jan says, "Fine." Walks away. A few minutes later, she comes back. She has a glass. It's not a little glass. It's a big glass full of ice and bourbon. George looked at that. His eyes, if they could have popped out of his head, they would have. But they didn't. They stayed in. And he says to Jan, "Jan, how long do you think I'm staying?" So we shot the bull a little bit more, and finally George thought he'd better go home before Flo gives him a call, because Flo has called up there and said, "Is my husband up there again? If he is, send him home. He doesn't need to be bothering you like that." Of course, we laughed about that because George was far from being a bother. So anyhow, George, of course, was not done with that drink yet. So my good wife fixed him up. poured it in a little sippy cup with a cap, sent him home on his way. And we made sure he promised, don't you dare take a sip of that until you're the whole way home. And I'm sure George did that because he was that kind of man. Another fond memory of George and I for about 5 summers, maybe started even in the spring. I'd get this phone call. Hey, Doug, I need some help. What now, George? My deck. Oh, yeah, your deck. We've been working on that deck for 4 or 5 years. Come on down, we'll take some boards off. I'll order some more, we'll get some more boards down. Well, we'd do that for a good while each summer. Finally, this last summer, I told George, and this is what I really respected about George, I felt he respected me also enough that he would take my opinion and say, hey, you know, maybe he's right, maybe it's time. And he did. We contacted a contractor, and he had a beautiful, beautiful deck made. He has a pretty complex deck down there, as some of you know. So it took us some time, but I told him, George, you'll never finish this. So that worked out. Recently, I had another humorous conversation with George that I'd like to share with you. It's a bit personal, but I don't think George would mind me telling it. It's the Barnaby story. About 2 weeks ago, Jan and I were down at their house. And it was, of course, a nice time as usual with George and Flo. But poor Barnaby was having a sort of a bad time. So anyhow, we did our thing that night, and before we left, I told George, if you have trouble, if you need help, you make sure you call me. Next morning, phone rings, it's George. George says, Doug, can you help me get the dog in the car? I can't lift him anymore. He won't get up and stay up. I said, I'll be right down. So Jan and I talked. I'm going to use my own car, put him in the back of our car so that George doesn't have to drive in that state of mind because we don't know what's going to happen. So he called ahead up to the vet. We got up to the vet, and they're busy. They have dogs, cats, horses, everything. George went up to the office. They said, as soon as we can get a room ready for Barnaby, 2 girls will come down with a stretcher-like thing, and we'll bring him up, check him over again, which they did maybe 2 hours later. But what was nice about that 2 hours of waiting, we got to talk again about everything. George can talk about anything. Politics, religion, sports, science. And you know what? He always kept his own opinion, and he always appreciated your opinion, which was, I just loved that man. So smart. But anyhow, George looked over at me. This is about after sitting there an hour, hour and a half. He looks over, he's sitting in the front seat with me. He looks over at me and he says, Doug, I'm going to tell you something that nobody else knows, even Flo. And I'm just thinking to myself, George, do you really want to do that? He said, yeah, I do. I want Flo to know this too, because I think it's something, and it comes here in a minute. He says, Doug, Barnaby's 11 and a half years old. He said, you realize that every night I take him out to go to the bathroom at 11 o'clock. We all do, I hope, at some time. So he says, you know, Doug, Barnaby's not the only one that goes to the bathroom. I said, oh, is that right? I said, that's nothing to be embarrassed about, George. I've done the same thing with our own dogs. It all depends on where you live, you know, I hope. But anyhow, he said, take 11 times 365. Do you realize how many times a year I'm doing that? But anyhow, 11 o'clock, George opens the door. Barnaby runs to the grass. George runs to the bushes. So I always thought that was really neat. George had 3 loves in his life that define what a wonderful, successful man he was. George was a strong Christian who loved and served God. We all know that. George loved his church and participated in every way that he could. We know that. George loved his beautiful family. He would beam when he spoke about David, Allie, and his 4 grandchildren. He loved to share memories and to share news of their accomplishments. He was an extremely proud and loving father and grandfather. We felt like we were in there too because we knew what exactly was going on also. He was just so proud. And then there was Flo. I can attest to the fact that George adored her in every aspect of their lives. Anything Flo wanted, George would do his best to deliver. Everything from cooking a delicious meal, baking a scrumptious dessert, or even dressing up like a long-haired bridesmaid in Dave and Sandy's mock wedding. I wish I had a picture of that with him wearing long blonde hair over that dark, tanned head. George would do it just to please Flo. Their 50 years of marriage is a testament to their enduring love and respect they had for one another, and he always treasured his queen. Two and a half hours is going pretty quick, isn't it? In closing, I just want to say a few words to George. I'm better for knowing you, better for loving you, better for having met you. May you be as blessed in the next life, my friend, as I was in this one by knowing you. George, until we meet again, I will sip a glass of bourbon and raise my glass to you, buddy, my friend. I love you and I will miss you. Thank you.
This is extremely difficult for me because I really love George. Before I retired, I was a trial lawyer for over 40 years. But I decided that this time, instead of using an outline, which was my normal practice, I was going to write out my remarks. I did this for 3 reasons. The first is if I follow what I wrote, there's less chance that I'll become emotional and cry. The second reason is that it's very important to me because this is George's funeral and I want to do a good job for his family. The third reason is that Flo coached some of the best public speakers in Virginia, and I don't want to disappoint her. This past April 11th, my wife, Dionne, who is one of Flo's younger sisters, died of cancer. Now my dear friend and brother-in-law, George West, has also died. I've always lived far away from my own family, So albeit I love my own two brothers, the truth be told, I have been closer to my brothers-in-law than my own brothers. George was my brother. He was the most laid-back and humble man I have ever met. George was the Eddie Albert counterpoint to Flo Xavier Gabor of Green Acres TV fame. If George was ever upset about anything, I never saw it, except for that one time when the liquor store was out of Jack Black. I went goose hunting with George at Pentatonix Reservoir when he was pursuing his doctoral degree. I spent several beach vacations at Myrtle Beach with he and Flo. I visited Flo and George many times when they lived in Virginia. Went golfing with George more times than I could count. And lately, I have spent many happy weekends visiting with Flo and George. Most of you may not know this, but George was the world's foremost authority on Western Pennsylvania chipmunks. Really, his dissertation was entitled The Migratory Habits of the Western Pennsylvania Chipmunk. That's true. Most people don't know this either about George, but when the professor whom George reported to while George was doing his research and writing his dissertation, he decided to use George's work for his own book. And as a result, George had to start over. If that had happened to me, I would probably still be in prison for what I would have done to the man. Not George. George did not hold grudges. He restarted his work and successfully wrote and defended his dissertation. Everyone here is either related to George or is one of his friends. I believe in my heart of hearts that each of us has been blessed by knowing George, and when we think back on how he made our lives just that much better because we knew him, it will help mitigate the grief and shock that we are now feeling. I want to leave you with a question. Did you ever know anyone who did not like George? Well, neither did I. Flo, I feel your pain. And I promise you I will be here for you as you navigate through the grief. I believe I can make the same promise for your other brothers and sisters. Today, unfortunately, we're here to say goodbye to our dear friend and brother, George West. And I'm reminded of the old Northern Arapaho Indian proverb, only the rocks live forever.
Hi. Ooh. I was hoping the speech would be a little more fluid, but you'll have to pardon me, as a lot of it may just be thread, because I just need to get through it. As all of you know, a father and daughter have a bond that lasts till the end of the time, but my relationship with my dad was even that much more special. Our typical day began at 9 a.m. If I called him, he didn't answer, I'd call him again. He didn't answer, I'd call him again, then leave a message. Then he'd call me back. And until that happened, until we finally spoke, we kept going. By around 10:30, we'd finally chat. And if one of us forgot that day, we would always hold each other accountable. That was the most special part of my day, was to talk to my dad. I'm sure it isn't a surprise to most of you that my father and I were very much alike, or maybe after looking back at it, I just idolized him so much that even at the age of 43, I just wanted to be just like him. I named my two sons after him, Kyle, George, and and Tyler West. My dad taught me to appreciate the finer things in life, but not to discredit the things that were around me all of the time. He taught me how to read directions and to appreciate why I was doing that. We both shared a love of sports, any sport, just something that got the blood pumping. We loved that. And he was immediately involved in every activity that I did. He was not just a spectator, but instead had really invested himself into everything that I was doing and interested in. During my swimming career, he was a top official, a stroke and turn judge. Now, I told you he'd like to follow the rules, and he liked to read directions. So my dad was definitely very black and white when it came to that. One of the most important races that I did, my father was a stroke and turn judge, and he disqualified me. Had I not been disqualified, I would have won. Insert my eye roll here. Thanks, Dad. When I approached him after and asked him why he would do such a thing to his one and only daughter, he simply looked at me and said, "Well, Allison, you didn't follow the rules." He was my biggest fan. He never missed a soccer game, to the point that when I was in college, he would travel the entire East Coast just so he could personally watch every single one. Some kids find that their college career helped them to find a way to breathe and break away from their parents, but my soccer and college career made me even closer to my dad, because I got to see him every weekend. My favorite time with my dad was 4 or 5 p.m. at the beach, cocktail in hand after a long day of searching for shark's teeth, reading and jumping waves. The sunset and his great company will always be in my memories. I have been overwhelmed by the outpouring of gratitude that my friends and family have expressed as far as my father and the impact on their lives. He taught many of my friends Biology 101 during the summer. And to quote one of my friends, Dan Kaufman, "My dad was a very smart man. His intelligence rose above, but he never talked down." He was the quintessential Renaissance man. He enjoyed a great bourbon, anywhere from Jack Daniel's to Elmer T. Lee, which he hides in a little canister down under his bar. And if you pick it up, it says, "If your name is not George West, you shouldn't be drinking this." He loved a great book. Daniel Silva was one of his favorites. And he enjoyed any movie with a high body count. Daddy, I love you so much, and this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. But I know you're by my side and helping me in every step of the way. And you're never forgotten, and you'll always be my rock. My heart is broken, but I'll never forget you, and you're my best friend in the whole entire world. And I love you so much.
Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dave, George's favorite son. I did not jot down any particular memories or any particular events or activities, but I never got a 9:30 a.m. phone call, I will say that, Allie. My dad taught me what it means to be a man. Not in the traditional sense. I don't remember us ever going hunting or fixing a car engine or anything like that. But I've always prided myself on being a man of my word. And I have tried to teach both of my children that your word is your bond and that you take care of others before you take care of yourself. There's absolutely no chance that I have lived up to that standard, and I know that. I don't think anyone in this room could live up to George West. But But I try every day, and I ask my sons to try every day to do what Dad would do. This isn't fair. I've been thinking that since I drove up from Pittsburgh Friday morning when I found out what had happened. I don't like the phrase, "this isn't fair." I don't like to hear it from my sons, I don't like to hear it from my students, and I don't like to hear it from myself. It isn't supposed to be fair. You're supposed to work through it. You're supposed to do what you can do to make the best of whatever it is. But this is not fair. He was too good. He was too loving. There were too many lives touched by his. Sorry. This is what was God thinking unfair. Which brings me back to what would Dad do? He would say, too bad, and we need to make the best of this. You need to take care of your mom, take care of your sister, take care of your wife, your kids, Walt, their kids. It's not fair. This past week, I can't believe it's only been a week. I feel like I've been back in Punxsutawney for at least a month. This week, just people coming by the house and calling and emailing and texting. I knew my dad as my dad. I knew of the rest of his life. But not surprisingly, I am not the only person who was so affected by him. The people calling, at last count, my dad had about 50, 60 best friends. Almost everyone that called the house said, George was my best friend. And that's something. Most of us are lucky to have one or two in our lives. The neighbors that said Dad would stop by their house on his way into town, even those whose house is not on the way into town. And he would just pop in. When I first met the pastor, she would told me about Dad popping in to the church when he was in town. He loved coming into town. Mom would say she needed something, and Dad was in the car coming into town. My sister and I used to roll our eyes a little bit at how often he'd come into town 2-3 times a day. But that was him. He would pop in. It isn't fair, and he would be horribly disappointed in us if we gave in to the unfairness. So what I'm going to ask you to do, what I'm asking myself to do, is to think, what would George do? I wish I'd had time to make little red rubber bracelets for everybody. WWGD, what would George do? And he would tell us to pick ourselves up and to be kind to one another. So in the next week, couple weeks, pop in on somebody. Just tell them hi. That's all you need to do. That's all he did. And we all know how much he loved us. So just pop in and say I love you by just saying, hey, how you doing? Thank you.
I am so blessed. I was the one who got to live 50 years with George West. Oh, thank you, God. Thank you for putting me in his life. He was my favorite person. He was my best friend. He was the love of my life. There was never arrogance or ego. or boastful pride in 1 ounce of his body. He was humble. He was authentic. He was genuine. In short, he was the real deal. George was so bright and so intelligent. He earned his PhD with honors from Pitt. But when someone would say, "Hey, Dr. West," he would always reply, "Please call me George." To his family and friends, he was honorable and true. His word or handshake was a solemn promise. He made everyone, all of us, comfortable by his presence. He put all of us at ease. George treated the world with respect. The custodian at the college got the very same genuine acknowledgement as did the president of the university. Every man was worthy to George. Every person deserved his time and attention. Everyone was equal in his eyes. And you know what is amazingly true? I have never met not one person in my 50 years with Geo who didn't like him. Not one. It's amazing. But it's true. He was approachable, unpretentious, and laid back with all types of people. And he was a steadfast rock for our family. What you saw out in the real world, friends, was what he was like every single day at home. Kind, steady, patient, and caring. He had the same sweet disposition every time he walked through the door. He's the most honorable person I've ever met. George did the right thing, and he was quiet and strong about it. He was our family's #1 supporter. He enthusiastically encouraged me and the kids in whatever we'd pursue or whatever challenges and risks we'd face. He was our biggest fan. He was our strongest cheerleader. George was a true Renaissance man. And because of that, he was so interesting to be with every day. He could watch the Pittsburgh Steelers in the afternoon and Dancing with the Stars at night. He could sit and view the luge in the Olympics or Les Miserables in the theater. He listened to everything from the village people to Sarah Brightman with a little jazz on the side. He would play a tough round of golf and come home and make a delicate cheesecake. You could talk to him about politics, gardening, movies, pastries, horse racing, books, religion, golf, fishing, birdhouses, bourbon, fine dining, squirrels, history, Broadway shows, the beach, science, boxing, education, and dogs, especially labs, and so on, and so on, and so on. A walk in the woods with George West by your side was an education. A dinner party with George West across the table was enlightening and humorous. A hospital stay with George standing quietly on guard all night was a calm and serene comfort. A memory of 2 children being raised by George was a gift from God. And a life of 50 years with George as your partner, well, that was a total blessing. In the best and worst of times, I would want George West. I love you, George West. I loved you since that blind date Jenny B. and John Schwartz arranged in 1969. I knew you were special, endearing, and precious. Way back then. And that has never, ever diminished in 50 years. One of the doctors, the wonderful doctors at Du Bois Hospital this week, noticed our bond and deep love even through George's condition. The doctor came into a private room and sat with me and said, "Flo, I have a question for you." And I said, "By all means." And he asked me to describe my marriage. I said, well, you know, Dr. Barron, I could explain it better with a metaphor. Our marriage was like flying a kite. George was on the ground, the rock, the steadfast foundation, and he held the string. I was the kite, making loops in the sky, flying freely and joyfully. George giving me all the line I ever needed, but holding that connection tightly. to support me. And suddenly, now, that line's been cut. I promise you, Georgie, somehow, some way, I will keep airborne. Because of your help and because of God's help, I will not come crashing down because you, my dearest, will help me from heaven. Oh, my wonderful darling, my love, my heart is broken. Goodbye, my beloved husband, and thank you for our life together. Oh, I just so want one more dance, one more kiss, one more hug of you. But dearest Gio, someday we will reunite and be together, and I will embrace you again and again and tell you how much I utterly, unabashedly adore you. And I loved you, George. I loved you. Until that day, George, you will remain right here in my heart forever, forever.
We thank you so much for being here to lift up George through the words that have been shared, the memories, and the love in this place. Let us now depart from this place carrying the love and the joy of George West with us. As the words of one of his favorite hymns, Lord of the Dance. They cut me down and I leapt up high. I am the life that will never, never die. I'll live in you if you'll live in me. I am the Lord of the dance, said he. Dance then wherever you may be. I am the Lord of the dance, said he. And I'll lead you all wherever you may be. And I'll lead you all in the dance, said he.